For 70 years, the old man quietly walked the field behind his house, fixing runway lights no one noticed anymore. They called it just an old habit. They said no one lands there anymore. Until one day, 4 helicopters appeared without warning and changed the fate of that land forever. Welcome to NT, where everyday kindness becomes unforgettable. Let's begin this journey together. On the southern edge of Ridgeville, a quiet little town nestled between soft hills and still water in Tennessee, there's a stretch of land the locals simply call Whitman's Field. No signs, no gates, nothing to catch your eye if you're just driving by, just a long, flat patch of open ground, covered in green grass, dotted with a few old landing lights leaning into the sky. But to Earl Whitman, 74 years old, that field is anything but ordinary. It's a quiet lifeline, a promise never spoken out loud, and the one thing he believes is still worth protecting, even if nobody else remembers why. Earl is the kind of man you might overlook at first glance. Tall, but stooped with age, hands rough and calloused, usually stuffed in the pockets of a faded denim jacket. His hair's turned completely white, and he always wears that old ball cap, stitched with the words, Korea Vet, 1st Cavalry. Every morning, before the sun even touches the pine trees, Earl walks the dirt path to the far end of the field, not to farm, not to garden, but to check the landing strip that once served as an emergency zone for military helicopters. He brings a rusted toolbox, bends down to wipe off dust from the lights, replaces batteries, clears out weeds near the edges of the strip, and though no aircraft has landed there in years, he never skips a day. People ask him, "Why do you still do all that? It's been a decade since anything touched down here." He just shrugs and says, all it takes is one night. One time someone needs a safe place to land, then all these years, they'll have meant something. It all started with his father, Calvin Whitman, a World War II pilot, who first opened the field for night training. Back then, there were no flight simulators. Young pilots needed real places to practice landings in the dark. Then came Earl. After serving in Korea, he took over. Same field, same lights, same crackly old radio. Kept running just in case someone out there still needed guidance. And then there's Dolores, his wife. A soft-spoken woman with her hair always pinned back neatly. Every time there was a night training session, she made hot coffee, egg and meat sandwiches, and left warm towels in the kitchen, just in case. "Can't expect those young boys to fly on an empty stomach," she'd say with a little grin. One night in 1987, during a thunderstorm, a training chopper lost engine power and couldn't make it back to base. Earl lit up the entire strip by hand, used the radio to give bearings, and stood in the pouring rain with a flashlight to guide the pilot in. The helicopter landed safely. That pilot, he's a general now. And every Christmas, he still sends a card that reads, "If it wasn't for you that night, I wouldn't be here to write this." But times changed. Fort Campbell switched to full simulation training. Night flight programs stopped using backup landing zones like Earl's, and Whitman's Field fell quiet. No calls, no choppers, just an old man checking lights every morning, and Dolores still brewing coffee, even though nobody's knocked on the door in years. Then one spring morning, while Earl was cleaning the lens of light number 4, a shiny black SUV rolled down the dusty road. The plates were unfamiliar. The wheels kicked up a cloud of dirt. Out stepped a young man in a sharp suit, polished shoes, and a glossy folder marked with a silver logo, Blue Horizon Developments. He approached with a polished smile and offered his hand. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman. I'm with Blue Horizon. We're scouting land for a new lakeside resort. And this property, well, it has a lot of potential." Earl didn't shake his hand. Didn't get angry either. He simply lowered the light fixture he was working on, wiped his hands on his pants, looked the man square in the eye, and said, voice rough but steady, "You see value your way. I've seen young men land here, soaked in sweat and blood, just trying to live through the night. The SUV turned around, leaving deep tire tracks in the soft dirt. Earl stood there, alone in the quiet field, where the morning sun was just beginning to light up the old runway lights. His hands tightened, but his eyes were brighter than ever. Do you think a place like that is worth keeping? If you do, drop a comment. Yes. The black SUV came back on a Thursday morning, just as quiet as the last time. But this time, it didn't just bring a handshake and a friendly smile. 3 men stepped out. The first was the same young rep in a suit, sharp, polished, holding a leather folder. The second looked older, more serious. Silver hair, dark shades, the kind of man who seemed to walk with a plan. The third was the deputy director of county planning, someone who once shook Earl's hand at last year's Veterans Day memorial. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman," the young rep said, like he was dropping by for coffee. "Let me be direct. The county's new development map lists this area as a mixed ecological growth zone. Your property sits right in the center." Earl stood on the porch, arms crossed. He didn't speak, just furrowed his brow slightly, not with anger, but with the kind of weight that comes from watching years pass and promises fade. Then the deputy director spoke. More blunt this time. "If you choose not to cooperate, well, certain things might shift. Tax assessments, access to utilities, long-term land use eligibility. No threats. No raised voices, just polite words wrapped around cold pressure. The kind written by men who'd never stood in a field during a storm, never flipped on a landing light to save a life. They left after 10 minutes. No contract, no letter. Just a folder left on the kitchen table. Ridgeville Development Adjustment Proposal, 2025. That night, Earl sat alone on the porch. A crescent moon hung low above the trees, casting soft shadows across the field. The runway lay still. Just the sound of crickets and wind rustling through early spring grass. He didn't think about politics. He didn't think about county boards. He thought about that night in the winter of 2003, when a Black Hawk ran out of fuel and a young crew had only 15 minutes left in the sky. Earl had lit the entire strip by hand. He'd stood in the freezing wind, radio in one hand, flashlight in the other. The helicopter landed. The entire crew survived. To most folks, it's just a patch of dirt, he thought. But for someone up there, it could mean everything. The next morning, Earl walked to the east end of the field. Left hand held an old wooden sign. Right hand gripped a rusted hammer. Each swing into the ground echoed like a heartbeat, a promise kept to his father, to the pilots he once guided, and to his own conscience. Painted in bold black letters, Military Training Zone, closing after 70 years. To those who trusted us, thank you. A few days later, a small article appeared in the Ridgeville Weekly. It was written by Clara Monroe, a young reporter new to town. She'd come out hoping to write a simple veteran with a story piece, but when she saw the sign and the look in Earl's eyes, she realized this wasn't about the past. This was about a battle happening now between those who preserve and those who erase. The article was titled, "What Does It Cost to Erase Loyalty?" and it struck a nerve. From veterans groups to military forums, from pilots who once landed in that field to cadets who'd never heard of it, people began sharing the story. The same question kept coming up: are we forgetting the people who held the ground so we could fly? That evening, Earl's old landline rang. He picked it up. "Mr. Whitman, please hold for General McKenna, Joint Chiefs of Staff." The phone rang at exactly 8:12 p.m. It was the old beige landline, the one that sat to the left of Earl's radio, same kind he'd used since the ADS. It rarely rang. Maybe his daughter hum on Sundays, or an elderly neighbor calling after a storm. But tonight, that sound cut through the quiet like something out of place, like a ripple in still water. Earl rose from his wooden porch chair, his hands still smelling faintly of linseed oil from fixing the west fence earlier that afternoon. He picked up the receiver. "Mr. Whitman, please don't hang up," a man's voice said quickly. "I'm transferring a call from Washington." Earl tightened his grip on the phone, not out of fear, but because deep down he knew something had just shifted. Seconds later, a steady, grounded voice came through, one that didn't need an introduction. "Mr. Earl Whitman, this is General Daniel McKenna, Joint Chiefs of Staff." The kitchen went still. Dolores turned from the sink, slowly laying down her dish towel. Earl stood tall, not out of respect for the rank, but because something instinctual told him this moment mattered. "I read the article," the general continued. "I saw the words you wrote on that sign. I'm not calling because of the media or because of pressure. I'm calling out of duty, because you've kept something alive, something most people have already forgotten." Earl didn't know how to respond. He wasn't good at phone conversations, and he sure wasn't used to being thanked by someone with stars on their collar. So he just said, softly, "I don't keep it out of duty, General. I keep it because some folks don't make it back. And sometimes I just figure if someone needs to land, I should still be here." The call lasted over 20 minutes. No talk of land rights, no legal details, no politics. Just two men from two generations talking about things you can't put in a contract, about trust, about old values, about young soldiers stepping off a chopper, drenched and exhausted but alive, because someone lit the way. At the end, General McKenna said, "Mr. Whitman, we can't let that field get buried under concrete. Give me 24 hours." Earl hung up the phone. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but because, for the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was standing alone. "Dolores, what is it?" she asked, turning. "General McKenna just called. He said he's going to do something." "The Pentagon?" she gasped. "Yeah, he heard about us." Dolores began to cry, not from hope, but because, after all those quiet decades, someone finally saw them. The next morning, Earl went about his routine. He fixed runway light 3, the one the wind had knocked crooked during the night. He wasn't expecting anything loud. He didn't expect anything at all. But just before noon, a familiar sound came rumbling through the trees. Low, heavy, shaking the ground. First came the Apache, slicing low across the tree line, circling once overhead. Then two Blackhawks from the southeast. And finally, a large white command chopper bearing the seal of the Pentagon on its tail. One by one, they descended onto the strip. The same strip Earl had marked, maintained, and watched over for 70 years. Dust rose in thick clouds. The doors opened. Out stepped a team of officers, 2 generals, 3 aides, and 1 man in civilian clothes, carrying a folder. Dolores stood on the porch, her hands trembling as she held a fresh cup of coffee. Earl stepped out from the tool shed, still holding his hammer. His work clothes were dark with patches of red clay on the knees. One of the 2 generals walked up and gave a proper salute. "Mr. Earl Whitman, we're here to make sure this field is never torn down, and to thank you for keeping a place the world should never forget." The Whitman kitchen had never seen this many people. 2 generals, a military attorney, a representative from the Department of Defense, and a young administrative officer, all gathered around the same old wooden table where Dolores had served coffee every morning for 40 years. No cameras, no press, no one trying to act important. Just uniforms, hands resting on folders, and eyes fixed on the silver-haired man across the table. Still in his dark work shirt, hands dusty, face calm as always, a document was laid on the table, thick, stamped, straight from Washington. "Mr. Whitman," the general said, This is a formal designation under Section 17 of the 1984 National Defense Readiness Act. Your property is now recognized as a protected tactical training site, a designated landing zone for emergency and reserve military use. In plain terms, no local authority, no private developer. No one had the right to build on, rezone, or repurpose this land ever again. Whitman's field was now part of the national defense grid. Earl picked up the pen. His hand trembled, not from age, but from the weight of the moment. He knew this would never come again. Just below the signature line, a line was printed in italics, maintained voluntarily from 195-12025, now protected, for those who may need it next. When he signed, Dolores gently placed her hand on his shoulder from behind. No one spoke. There was only a silence so deep it felt like the house itself was exhaling. The general nodded and stood up, smiling. You held this ground for those who had nowhere else to land. Now it's our turn to hold it for you. Before he left, he turned back with a more serious tone. We have one more stop today. The folks over at Blue Horizon headquarters need to hear what they've been ignoring for too long. Inside a sleek glass conference room, 3 Blue Horizon executives sat across from a group of uniformed officers, not armed with threats, but with a presence that couldn't be denied. The Horizon Springs Resort project has gone far enough, said one general, his voice calm but firm. The land at the heart of your plan, where Mr. Whitman lives, has now been declared a national tactical priority zone. One of the executives tried to cut in. But we filed the permits, the local government. Has been overruled, the general interrupted. It's now under direct control of the Department of Defense. No more sales pitches. No more talk about shared visions for the future. Just binding federal orders, official stamps, and the quiet, immovable presence of men who had once stood in combat zones, who now stood for something else. Honor. One of the younger staffers, the same man who had once visited Whitman's home, looked down at the table. No more confidence, no more charm, only quiet discomfort. When faced with something money could never buy. Dignity. Outside, the evening sun cast golden light across the field. Dolores was out back, scattering hay for the old horse near the fence. Earl stood in the middle of the field, watching the new row of landing lights, modern LEDs, weatherproof, and now activated by radio control. Beside him stood Jimmy, his 26-year-old grandson, who had just graduated from an aviation school in Texas. You really think someone's ever going to land here again? Jimmy asked, a hint of doubt in his voice. I'm sure of it, Earl replied, eyes fixed on the lights. Maybe not this week, maybe not this year, but one day, someone's going to need it. And when that day comes, this place will still be here. The old wooden sign that once read Military Training Zone Closing still stood, but now it had a fresh white line painted underneath. Now protected, in honor of every landing that saved a life. Evening in Ridgeville. The golden light of sunset spilled across the quiet field, across the fresh-cut grass, over the worn porch steps, and down the rows of newly restored lights shining brighter than ever. Jimmy Whitman stood in the center of the strip, wearing a gray t-shirt and khakis. He held a wireless controller in his hand, checking each light just like his grandfather used to do. Only this time he was using equipment provided by the military, but one thing he didn't change. Grandpa always walked the entire runway, even when he could see it from the porch, Jimmy said. He told me, if you want to keep something safe, you've got to walk it, touch it, not just watch it from a screen. Inside the house, Earl sat on his porch chair, holding a cup of coffee. He watched Jimmy silently. No words, just a calm expression. Like something he had waited a lifetime for was finally happening. Dolores opened the door, holding a warm tin of homemade cookies. Does he still like cinnamon waffles? Not sure, Earl said with a small smile, but he likes doing things nobody else wants to do. That's enough. That night, for the first time in years, the landing lights lit up all at once at exactly 9:00 p.m. in sync with a special flight training schedule from Fort Campbell. From the distance came the unmistakable sound of rotor blades, low, steady, deep, a U-860 Blackhawk. Then two Apaches, circling low. Jimmy stood still on the runway, looking up, toggling lights based on the chopper's flight path. Beside him, Earl stood silent. No headset, no radio. He didn't need one. Just being there was enough. As the first helicopter touched down and grass dust rose around them, Jimmy turned his face away from the wind, but Earl just smiled. "That's the best sound I've ever known," he whispered. After the landing, a young pilot, a woman, stepped down, pulled off her helmet, and walked toward Jimmy. "Are you Whitman?" "I'm Jimmy. My granddad. Your grandfather guided my dad when he lost his bearings back in 2002. We still have a photo of this place in our living room." "Really?" "We call it the Field of Second Chances." She smiled and shook his hand. "Thank you for keeping it alive." From above, Whitman's field looked like a constellation of stars glowing close to the earth. The old sign, "Military Training Zone, Closing," still hung inside the barn, but now it was framed with one final line added underneath. "This field waited, and you came back." That night, Earl sat beside his grandson, both of them looking up at the sky full of stars. "Do you ever regret it?" Jimmy asked. "No," Earl said slowly, "because now you understand the most important part. It was never about the lights. It was about why we kept them on. In a world racing toward everything newer, faster, flashier, we sometimes forget the things that used to hold us together. An old dirt road, a light no one pays attention to, and an old man who quietly kept a promise for 70 years. Earl Whitman never wanted fame. He didn't keep that field for recognition. He kept it because he knew if no one holds on to these things, then when we finally need them, they'll be gone. And maybe, in your own way, you've walked through a Whitman field of your own, a family tradition you've held on to, a story you've kept quiet, or simply a belief that loyalty, kindness, and honor still have a place in this world. So if this story reminds you of someone who once lit the way for you, literally or figuratively, drop their name in the comments below. And if you believe the world still needs people like Earl Whitman, just write one word: respect. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss more real, meaningful stories like this. This is NT Amazing Stories, where we tell the stories the world's starting to forget, but your heart still remembers.